Hey everybody, this is a paper by David Seymour, and I'm going to read a little short blurb about him from the Critical Theories of Anti-Semitism website. David Seymour is a lecturer in law at the City Law School, City University, London. He received an LLM from the LSE and gained his PhD in social and critical theory from the University of Warwick in 2000. His research interests include intellectual property, law and the arts, with special interest in art and music, legal theory, social legal theory, and critical legal theory. His monograph on law, anti-Semitism, and the Holocaust was published by Routledge I've always read it. Maybe it's Routledge. No, but I think it's Routledge. I'm not sure though. Okay. The paper is titled Disavowal, Distinction, and Repetition, Alain Badiou and the Radical Tradition of Anti-Semitism. Introduction. Quote, I challenge anyone to find a single line in any of my works that can be called anti-Semitic. End quote. Alain Badiou, 14th of August, 2014. My focus in this chapter on the militant French philosopher Alain Badiou emerges from my work into the various ways that the Shoah has been incorporated into anti-Semitic ways of thinking. In what follows, I argue that Badiou's thoughts on what he terms, quote, uses of the word Jew, end quote, in general, as well as on the Shoah in particular, offers a series of continuities with what can be called the radical tradition of anti-Semitism, a tradition that reaches back at least as far as Bruno Bauer's anti-emancipationist Avant les Lettres anti-Semitic texts of the 1840s. It simultaneously questions the notion of a sharp rupture between what have been termed, quote, classical and, quote, new anti-Semitism. It questions also the place of the Shoah, which is the Holocaust, if you don't know, in recent critical thinking within a dialectic of disavowal, distinction, and repetition. The radical tradition of anti-Semitism, radical thought. Beginning after the rise, or more appropriately, the defeat of National Socialism, anti-Semitism has almost completely been identified with the right and far right of the political spectrum. However, its contemporary iteration within so-called, quote, left circles has brought that seemingly natural identification into question. Although accepting the limits of a, quote, natural identification and exhaustion of anti-Semitism with the right and far right, I correspondingly eschew a similarly naturalized correlation with socialist and communist praxis. This is not to say that anti-Semitism is absent from that wing of the political spectrum. Rather, it seems to me that the essence of Marx's critique of capitalism and its political and social manifestations serve as a welcome disciplinary constraint on the blunderbuss typical of much non-Marxist radical oppositional praxis, both of the past and the present. Indeed, Marx's work on the Jewish question from 1844, I think it might be from 1843, either way, doesn't matter, through to the 3 volumes of Capital, 1867 to 83, well, the 3 volumes of Capital. The first one was published in 1867, but the other ones were published later. I don't think Capital Volume 3 came out until the 1890s after being edited by Engels. Anyway, serves in part precisely to put a brake on the personification of capitalist social relations without which anti-Semitism cannot begin to be thought. That there should be confusion between, quote, left and, quote, radical ways of thinking and the expression of anti-Semitism is not, however, solely a conceptual matter. Many of those who peddled the errant nonsense of anti-Semitism were often recognized, quote, radical journalists and social commentators whose work on this subject sold well, with many books and pamphlets running into several editions. Equally, they were penned as contributions to significant debates taking place within the left and were often treated with the utmost seriousness. In this context, it is worthy of note that although Marx and Engels did not directly confront the anti-Semitic content of many of these contributions, with the exception of On the Jewish Question, and here it says 1843, and The Holy Family of 1844. They nevertheless felt that such works provided enough of a temptation to counter them in many of their own books and articles. Here one need only think of Marx and Engels' critiques of Proudhon, Bauer, Dühring, and Adolf Wagner, writings that spanned both thinkers' lifetimes. In view of these comments, radical anti-Semitism can be defined as that way of thinking, disciplined neither by Marx nor many strands of Marxism in both its socialist and liberal manifestations. It is radical because, unequipped with even a hint of rational understanding of the world, and absent a recognition of the complex and obscure nature of modern capitalist relations, it remains unconstrained in its flights of fancy due to a lack of critique sustained by a praxis of experience and reason. Instead, it points to an unreasoned, indeed anti-reason, utopian and absolute opposition to all that is. It offers an evaluation of the social world in which nothing that exists is of value, and as such needs to be overthrown in toto. This nihilism is carried out as the herald of the new and final emancipation of an equally abstract concept of, quote, man. Such thought, often, but not always, allocates, quote, the Jew, end quote, and the supposed dominance and domination of, quote, Jewish values, end quote, as the major block to that transcendence. It is within this radical tradition that Badiou's thinking can be situated. Distinction and disavowal. A common characteristic between, quote, classical and, quote, new anti-Semitic ideology is that each begins with a disavowal and a distinction. Both iterations will often begin by acknowledging and lamenting prior forms of anti-Jewish hostility. This opening gambit of disavowal is followed immediately by a distinction between these disavowed ideologies and the writer's own, quote, novel, end quote, contribution. This duality of disavowal and distinction expresses itself by claims to, quote, objectivity, end quote, such that though some might find that they have to, quote, report negative aspects, This duality of disavowal and distinction expresses itself by claims to, quote, objectivity, such that though some might find what they have to, quote, report negative as regards the, quote, Jews, end quote, it is rather a result of careful, quote, scientific, end quote, inquiry. To echo this point, many, but by no means all, claim that they would wish no harm to the Jews of their own day, but feel duty-bound to report the findings of their research to a wider audience, hitherto deceived by a, quote, Jewish-controlled or, quote, Jewish-sympathetic press. This tendency to distinction and disavowal is clearly in evidence from the earliest works of, quote, classical anti-Semitism. For example, Wilhelm Marr's The Victory of Judaism over Germanism, published in 1879, opens with the following sentences, quote, "What I intend to accomplish is less a polemic against Judaism than it is a statement of facts regarding cultural history. I therefore unconditionally defend Jewry against any and all religious persecution, and that it is hardly more possible to express this more closely than I have done here. On the other hand, I emphasize the indisputable truth. With the Jews, the Romans have forced a tribe upon the West, which, as history shows, has thoroughly hated all was thoroughly hated by all peoples of the world, end quote. A second common theme is that of the shift from Jewish powerlessness to almost unlimited Jewish power. This second constant is illustrated in the reference to the idea of, quote, victory, present in the title of Mar's tract. While acknowledging that at some points in history Jews may have been subject to great hardships, they are presented as turning that powerlessness into virtually absolute power. More often than not, such an inversion is to be explained by their own underhand and malevolent maneuvers. A similar play of disavowed distinction and repetition can be found in the work of Alain Badiou. Alain Badiou, Distinction, Disavowal, and the Ideology of Anti-Semitism. In the, quote, introduction to the section, quote, uses of the word, quote, Jew, end quote, in the collection Polemics, Badiou acknowledges the traces of 1930s anti-Semitism within certain strains of contemporary France's left and right. He recognizes also its presence among some of those claiming support for Palestinians. Yet, having done so, he downplays it to such an extent that it no longer appears as a serious concern for the present. Having spoken of what is the presumed distinction between, quote, classic and, quote, new anti-Semitism, Badiou continues, quote, this being the case, it doesn't seem to me that the data concerning anti-Semitism, or bracket concerning anti-Semitism, end bracket, which are freely available, are such that they justify a full alert, although it should be clear that on such questions the imperative of vigilance admits of no interruption, end quote. Writing a few years later, but with an ill-tempered inflection, Badiou repeats this point but adds to it some, quote, originality. After again discussing what he sees as the declining legacy of anti-Semitism among left and right, and the French state, at least since the time of Barrès, I don't know how you say that, B-A-R-R-E-S, I think it's Barrès, but maybe I'm wrong. Maybe just Bar. I think it is just Bar. I'm not sure. But you know how it's spelled, so if you know French, you know how to say it. Quote, today there is nothing of this radical kind in France. Of this racial kind in France, and for good reason. Before the war, the majority of Jews were foreigners who had arrived from Poland, Lithuania, or Romania who spoke Yiddish and belonged to the poorest section of the working class. They were the Arabs and Africans of their day. Nowadays, Jews are pretty well, quote, integrated, end quote, and this kind of anti-Semitism and racism finds other targets, end quote. Badiou's point here, of course, is to make a distinction from and disavow of the past, when Jews were the target of anti-Semitism, and today when they are not. Yet this account of the distinction between past anti-Semitism and the presumed absence of contemporary anti-Jewish hostility contains some questionable assumptions. First, as the quotation makes clear, Badiou reduces anti-Semitism solely to its racist variant. All other forms of the expression of anti-Semitism are excluded. Equally troubling is Badiou's overlooking the fact that, while non-domicile Eastern European Jews were the target of French and Vichy anti-Semitism, so too were the, quote, integrated, end quote, French Jews of the time. It is only by adopting these narrow conceptions of anti-Semitism that Badiou can speak about anti-Semitism as the form of racism suffered by Arabs and Africans living in France, and of course not only France. And of course, in other words, anti-Semitism as an ideology that historically always placed, quote, the Jew, end quote, at the center of its imagination becomes now little more than an abstract concept applied to any and all those subject to racist and discriminatory praxis. Distinguished from its historical meaning, animosity against Jews, quote, as Jews, end quote, in this manner, it becomes an empty vessel able to be filled with other distinct forms of racism, in this instance the very real discrimination against Arabs and Africans, quote, as Arabs and Africans, end quote. Let me sip this syrup. That's good. My friend bought me coffee the other day, or yesterday. It was very sweet of her. Oh, okay. The triumph of Jewish particularism over the universalism of man. This combat between universalism of, quote, man, against, quote, Jewish particularism, end quote, that is noted above, is part of the definition of the radical tradition of anti-Semitism, appears in the canon in two forms. The first is the idea that Jews can never be part of the universal as long as they remain Jews. The second is the belief that current claims to universalism present in liberal and modern democracies are a sham masking their usurpation by, quote, Jewish values, which therefore serve an alleged Jewish self-interest. As will become clear in the following discussion, elements of both observations are present within Badiou's thinking on the Holocaust and the Jews, most notably around questions of human rights and the state of Israel. Each of these formulations will be addressed in turn. A. Universal humanity versus Jewish particularism, parenthesis, exceptionalism, end parenthesis. Perhaps the earliest example of the conflict between an abstract universalist conception of, quote, man and stubborn Jewish particularism or exceptionalism within the radical tradition of anti-Semitism can be found in the anti-emancipation tracts of Bruno Bauer. Quote, the Jew, on the other hand, has to break not only with his Jewish nature, but also with the development towards perfecting his religion, a development which has remained alien to him, end quote. Importantly for the present context, Bauer's argument and the reason Marx felt called upon to challenge it, was that it originated not from the Christian right, but from the, quote, critical, end quote, left. Yet this did not stop Bauer utilizing the former's arguments for his own anti-emancipationist thinking. In what Draper calls an act of, quote, wooden sectarianism, end quote, Bauer argues that since no one in the Christian state of the time was free, for the Jews to seek emancipation as Jews would be to make them a special case or to award them, quote, special privileges over and above the rest of the population. For the Jews to be free, therefore, would mean not only fighting for their own emancipation, but for the emancipation of all. Moreover, since the modern secular state meant for Bauer the emancipation of, quote, man, from the constraints of religion, the Jews had to renounce their Judaism to be emancipated within this new state form. To argue otherwise, whether it was seeking emancipation in the Christian state or in the secular state, the Jews, as long as they remain Jews, would be putting their own particularism over and above that of the universal. He writes, quote, bracket, the Jews, end bracket, Jewish and restricted nature always triumphs in the long run over his human and political obligations. The prejudice remains even though it is overtaken by universal principles. But if it remains, it is more likely to overtake everything else. If they wish to become free, the Jews should not embrace Christianity, but Christianity in dissolution, and more generally religion in dissolution, i.e. Enlightenment criticism and its product, free humanity, ... Quote, the Jews give nothing to humanity when he lays aside his limited law, end quote, when he abolishes all his Judaism, end quote. This theme of Jewish particularism claiming privileges at the expense of human universal emancipation resurfaces in terms reminiscent of Bauer in Badiou's, quote, introduction to his, quote, uses of the word, quote, Jew. in the series of essays, extracts, and interviews that constitute the collection Polemics. Thus he writes, quote, "An abstract variation of my position consists in pointing out that from the Apostle Paul to Trotsky, including Marx and Freud, Jewish communitarianism has only underpinned creative universalism insofar as there have been new points of rupture with it. It is clear that today's equivalent of Paul's religious rupture with established Judaism, of Spinoza's rationalist rupture with the synagogue, or of Marx's political rupture with the bourgeois integration of a part of his community of origin, is a subjective rupture with the state of Israel, not with its empirical existence, which is neither more or less impure than that of all states, but with its exclusive identitarian claim to be a, quote, Jewish state, and with it draws incessant privileges from this claim, especially when it comes to trampling underfoot what serves us as international law," end quote. In this formulation, as with Bauer, for Jews to, quote, identify with the state of Israel as a, quote, Jewish state, and here Badiou does not refer to the phrase, quote, homeland for the Jews, end quote, is not only to stand against, quote, creative universalism, but also to, quote, draw incessant particularist privileges, end quote, against the universalism of international law. They must, in other words, complete a rupture with Israel. Badiou, like Bauer before him, demands that for Jews to enter the universal struggle for emancipation demands that they give up not only their Judaism, Paul, their religious practices, Spinoza, their communal networks, Marx. But Badiou himself also now adds the rejection of Jews' claims to national self-determination. However, implicit in the demand that contemporary Jews effect a, quote, rupture with the state of Israel, Badiou demands a corresponding demand that Jews, quote, forget the Holocaust, end quote. The connection between these two calls becomes apparent in these comments, quote, "It is obviously necessary not only for the Jews but for all of humanity not to forget the destruction of European Jews. What is at issue here is not exclusively a memory. It is a question of thought, of a great philosophical mediation. The only thing we can retain here is a principle of universal scope. There is something monstrous about determining a state from a racial, mythical, or religious point of view, or more generally by appealing to particularity. That is why, although the destruction of the European Jews ought never to be forgotten, it is nonetheless dangerous to tackle the concrete problems of the Israeli state based on this destruction. The memory of the Holocaust concerns all human beings, but paradoxically, in the concrete circumstances of the Middle East, we have to, strict asceticism, forget the Holocaust, since we are exclusively faced with the practical necessity of having to found a new kind of peace by means of a new kind of political, i.e., universal, subjectivity." End quote. Moreover, it is by continuing to remain faithful to their particular identity as Jews, as well as to the, quote, memory of the Holocaust, that the Jews are said to gain a, quote, exception, or, quote, privilege, not available to other peoples. Quote, "There is no reason to make on this point, bracket, the state as a, quote, open conception, end quote, to make a, quote, Jewish exception, end quote. The argument traditionally advanced for such an exception evokes the singularity of the destruction of the European Jews by the Nazis. The question of the destruction of European Jews is a German and European question. If we are to come to a resolution of a Middle East problem, we must manage, and I know it's difficult, to forget the Holocaust," end quote. However, when we come to examine Badiou's account of the Holocaust itself, not only does he, again echoing Bauer, claim that a specifically Jewish memory of the Holocaust gives to Jews and the, quote, Jewish, end quote, state what amounts to an, quote, exceptional privilege, end quote. But, more fundamentally, he also claims that any connection made between those murdered as Jews by the Nazis, and those Jews alive today is an illegitimate usurpation of the Shoah. Making such a connection for Badiou reflects a particularist, quote, Jewish self-interest, end quote, and an illustration of, quote, Jewish privilege, end quote. B. The usurpation of the Shoah and Jewish cultural dominance. Badiou's thinking on this point arises from his understanding of the nature of the Shoah, while his framing it within the dialectic of universalism and particularism informs his work as a whole. For Badiou, the obsession with, quote, the Jews, end quote, stems from the Nazis presenting their own national and racial particularism in universal terms. It was, he says, the Jews as the, quote, name of names, end quote, that stands for the universality that Nazism could not but mark for destruction according to the, quote, logic of its own claims. In order to claim its own pseudo-universalism, Nazi particularism had to destroy the, quote, true universalism as represented in, quote, the name, quote, Jew, end quote, end quote. Yet Badiou's account is not without its own ambiguities. Badiou argues that choosing Jews to fulfill this negative role was not arbitrary, but rather turns on what he sees as a real link between the name, quote, Jew, and, parenthesis, true, i.e. ontological, and, parenthesis, universalism. This affinity, however, points less to the particularism of actually living Jews and more to an abstract and nameless ontological universalism that lies at the heart of that identity. Although such a contradiction is present in all others targeted by National Socialism, quote, the gypsies, the mentally ill, homosexuals, communists, end quote, Badiou nonetheless states, quote, the choice of this name relates, without any doubt, to its obvious link with universalism, in particular revolutionary universalism, to that which was in effect already void, bracket, i.e. absent, end bracket, about this name. That is, what was connected to the universality and eternity of truths, end quote. Still, despite the arguing that the link between Jews and universalism is, quote, without any doubt, end quote, legitimate, Badiou continues almost immediately by dissociating his claim from that of National Socialism. He does so by claiming that the Nazi category of, quote, the Jews, end quote, be understood solely as a category created from within Nazism itself. Quote, nevertheless, inasmuch as it served to organize the extermination, the name, quote, Jew, end quote, was a political creation of the Nazis, without any pre-existent referent. It is a name whose meaning no one can share with the Nazis, a meaning that presumes the simulacrum and fidelity to the simulacrum, and hence the absolute singularity of Nazism as a political sequence, end quote. From this account of his understanding of the Shoah, Badiou draws two negative but interrelated conclusions. First, any link made between Jews murdered by the Nazis and Jews alive today is illegitimate. And second, those who make such a connection, most specifically in relation to the state of Israel, gain some form of protected exceptionalism denied other states and peoples. It is in the context of these conclusions that Badiou believes that he has identified the contemporary existence of what has been a staple of radical anti-Semitic literature, Jewish privilege. As to the conclusion, the illegitimacy of any connection between Jews murdered by the Nazis and Jews alive today, Badiou poses a radical disjuncture, as is evident in the rhetorical flourish of an unanswered question. To show such a connection, he argues as follows, quote, "It would be necessary to explain how and why the Nazi predicate, quote, Jew, end quote, such as it was used to organize separation, then deportation and death, coincides with the subject predicate under which the alliance, bracket, i.e. between Jews murdered by the Nazis and contemporary Jews, end bracket, is sealed," end quote. As we have seen, it is precisely the impossibility of such explanation that lies at the core of Badiou's understanding of the nature of National Socialism and the Shoah. Badiou's second conclusion follows from his first, by falsely claiming a connection between Jews murdered by the Nazis and Jews alive today. Jews gain an illegitimate privilege through their suffering at the hands of the Nazis that protects them from criticism, most notably from criticism aimed at the State of Israel. Badiou articulates this second point through reference to the Jewish origins of the dominance of, quote, victimhood, end quote, of contemporary society discussed above. It is again worth quoting Badiou at length. Quote, "The basic argumentation, of course, refers to the extermination of European Jews by the Nazis and their accomplices, in the victim ideology that constitutes the campaigning morality of contemporary moralism. This unprecedented extermination is held to be paradigmatic. In and of itself, the extermination would underpin the political, legal, and moral necessity to hold the word, quote, Jew, end quote, above all handling of identity predicates, and to give it some kind of nominal sacralizing. The progressive imposition of the word, quote, Shoah, can be taken as a verbal sacralizing of victims. By a remarkable irony, one therefore comes to the point of applying to the name, quote, Jew, a claim that the Christians originally directed at all Jews themselves, which was that, quote, Christ, end quote, was a name worthier than all others, end quote. The implication here is that what amounts to the doomed, quote, chosen, end quote, status allocated not only by Christianity, but more specifically by the Nazis, is now inverted into a privilege. In other words, just as the radical tradition of anti-Semitism spoke of how, after generations of eking out a living on the margins of European society, the Jews following emancipation were seen to have gained unwarranted and corrupt advantages, so Badiou lays out a similar path and inverts a moment of almost absolute Jewish powerlessness into one of almost exceptional Jewish power. In this instance, the, quote, sacralization, end quote, and hierarchical, quote, worthiness, end quote, is far from innocent. It is rather pressed into direct service for what is seen as the illegitimate defense of particularist Jewish interests, most notably the State of Israel. The alleged Jewish power is for Badiou entrenched not only in the, quote, contemporary moralism, end quote, that marks post-Holocaust society, but also in the dominant place gained by Jews through their unwarranted link with the Shoah itself. Nowhere are these points more in evidence than in the following, quote, "Today it is not uncommon to read that, quote, Jew, end quote, is indeed a name beyond ordinary names. And it seems that, like an inverted original sin, the grace of having been an incomparable victim can be passed down not only to descendants of descendants, but to all who come under the predicate in question, be they heads of state or armies engaging in severe oppression of the lands they have confiscated. Less rational is the claim that we can find the means in Nazi gas chambers with which to confer on the colonial state of Israel some special status other than that all colonial states other than that all colonial states already have conferred on them for some decades. End quote. As this quotation indicates, alongside the notion of the contemporary Jews, that contemporary Jews have illegitimately usurped the legacy of the Shoah is the idea that they have done so in the name of their own particularist and parochial interest. From Badiou's perspective, commemoration and memory of the Shoah is little more than a weapon used by Jews to unjustifiably, and against all evidence, silence criticism of Israel. Moreover, the manner in which Badiou sees the articulation of this weaponization of the Shoah is inherent in the claim of contemporary anti-Semitism. As noted in this essay's first section, this is a claim to which Badiou denies any empirical existence. Quote, "It is wholly intolerable to be accused of anti-Semitism by anyone for the sole reason, from the fact of the extermination, one does not conclude as to the predicate, quote, Jew, end quote, and its religious and communitarian dimensions, that it receives some singular valorization, a transcendent annunciation, nor the Israeli exactions, whose colonial nature is patent and banal, be specially that nobody any longer accept publicly or privately this type of political blackmail," end quote. Badiou. C. Jewish particularism as false universalism. It is not without significance that, as noted above, a common characteristic of the radical tradition of the anti-Semitic canon is written from the position of a resigned defeat. As Zimmerman notes in his biography of Marr, this perspective is far from a rhetorical gesture, but something seriously believed. Indeed, a recurrent theme of this literature is the self-image of the anti-Semite as defeated victim at the hand of the Jewish victor. Although for some this dialectic of defeat and victory comes at the expense of presumed, quote, national values, end quote, for others, it is presented as the defeat of an abstract universal humanity at the expense of a dominant and dominating Jewish particularism. In his On the Jewish Question, Bauer prefigures this resignation of defeat at the hands of, quote, the Jews, end quote, that becomes a common theme of the later anti-Semitic radicals' canon. He writes, quote, "The Jew who in Vienna, for example, is only tolerated in the whole empire by his financial power. The Jew who may have no rights in the smallest German state decides the fate of Europe. While corporations and guilds refuse to admit Jews or have not yet adopted a favorable attitude towards Jews, the audacity of industry mocks at the material institutions," end quote. Bruno Bauer. After Jewish emancipation, it appeared as an accepted fact the notion of Jewish privilege determining the, quote, the fate of Europe, end quote, reappears in the Nazi-era writings of German jurisprudent Carl Schmitt. Now, Jewish privilege and power were no longer believed to stand in opposition to formal state and social forms, but rather to have infused them with so-called, quote, Jewish values. Viewed from this perspective, the universalistic claims within liberal democracies, the rule of law, universal suffrage, etc., are but shams masking their, quote, Jewish content. Nowhere is this point more to the fore than in Schmitt's 1938 work, Leviathan. In this book, Schmitt offers a thorough rejection of the liberal nation-state in general, and and the rights that comprise it in particular. He argues that the origins and development of political and juridical rights arose from the compromises negotiated through the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648 to the end of the bloody 30 Years' War, signaling this moment as pivotal for the, quote, decline of the West, end quote. Schmidt maintains that these compromises resulted in moments of individual freedom immune to sovereign power and which, through gradual increases over the centuries, led to sovereignty's demise. He held that this, quote, defeat, end quote, of, quote, the political, end quote, resulted directly in what he understood as the social anarchy of the Weimar democracy and of liberal democracy in general. Although Schmidt acknowledges the place of Hobbes and others in this defeat, he adds an anti-Semitic gloss. He claims that once these moments of individual freedom came into existence, they were open to manipulation by, quote, the Jews, end quote, who, having jumped at the opportunity, harnessed them for their own nefarious and negative interest. Over time, these, quote, particularist, end quote, Jewish values, wrapped in a sham universalism, gained supremacy over the entire body politic, not only in Germany, but also in Europe and elsewhere. The expansion of universal rights, the rule of law, and the concomitant demise of sovereignty, as well as social and cultural homogeneity, brought, quote, the Jews, end quote, their victory. Dominance and domination. Updated from 1648 through 1938 to 1948, Badiou repeats the same story through what he sees as the contemporary dominance of, quote, ethics over that of, quote, the political, of a specious Jewish particularism masquerading as a faux universalism, and in so doing obscuring its authentic counterpart. Drawing on Nietzsche's On the Genealogy of Morals, published in 1887, Badiou constructs this aspect of his thinking around a critique of both human rights and contemporary ethics, more specifically the ethics of alterity. Turning first to his critique of human rights, we see that Badiou draws a correspondence between Nietzsche's aphorism, quote, evil is derived from the good, and not the other way around, end quote, and the nature of contemporary human rights, their form and content. He argues that human rights represent the, quote, good, end quote, that as for Nietzsche, the Nietzschean slave, follows from and is defined by a prior definition of, quote, evil, end quote. In this instance, the, quote, evil, end quote, that is the progenitor of the, quote, good, end quote, of human rights is that of the victim of the mid-century totalitarian campaigns through which humans are stripped down to their mere, quote, animality, end quote. One second. Measured by such a concept of, quote, evil, the protection offered by human rights is nothing more than the right not to be harmed or hurt. In other words, far from representing human beings and their humanity and creativity, human rights reduces man to little more than a victim and animal. Quote, ethics, bracket, human rights, end bracket, subordinates the identification of this subject to the universal recognition of the evil that is done to him. Ethics thus defines man as a victim, end quote. If it is the case that Badiou's depiction and rejection of human rights arises from the mid-20th century experience of totalitarianism and the camps that were the emblems of their terror directly, as well as the Nazi death camps of the Shoah indirectly, No such ambiguity remains in the account of his related critique of what he sees as the perniciousness of the, quote, ethics of alterity, end quote. Here Badiou emphasizes the passivity that he believes he has identified in the nature of human rights. In so doing, he brings to his aid the second of Nietzsche's aphorisms that, quote, man would rather will nothing than not will at all. Yet in so doing, he traces the origin of this passivity in the face of the other, understood in this context as the, quote, ethics of differences, end quote, or, quote, recognition of the other, end quote, to that of the Jewish theology, via Emmanuel Levinas, which he opposes to Greek philosophy. In so doing, of course, he reproduces at the level of ethics the distinction between the mortal, mere animality, and the immortal, man. Quote, according to Greek thought, adequate action presumes an initial theoretical mastery of experience, which ensures that the action is in conformity with the rationality of being. From this point of departure are deduced laws in the plural of the city and of action. According to Jewish ethics, in Levinas' sense, everything is grounded in the immediacy of an opening to the other, which disarms the reflective subject. The, quote, thou, bracket you, end bracket, prevails over the, quote, I, end quote, such is the meaning of the law, end quote. To put Badiou's arguments in other terms, the passivity of the mortal, present in the universalist aspects of human rights and the ethics of difference, in the face of the will of the immortal, is the consequence of Jerusalem's triumph over Athens. That is, a victory that underpins the entirety of contemporary society. Conclusion. There is a certain irony inherent in both Badiou's conclusions and his use of Nietzsche in arguing for this, quote, Jewish, end quote, triumph. Just as Nietzsche's On the Genealogy of Morals introduces the figures of the slave and the noble, so Badiou brings into being the mortal and immortal. Badiou's own voice is that of the immortal. Yet to adopt and adapt these figures in this way is to miss the irony that infuses Nietzsche's own formulations. Nietzsche's irony is evident when he shows that the voice of the noble, like that of the immortal, is in fact the voice of the slave. Nowhere is this more evident than in Book 2, Section 7, where the, quote, noble, end quote, blames the Jews for the corrupt condition of the social and political world. However, when read through the prism of resentment, this alleged nobility is in reality nothing other than the slave's own distorted self-image and self-perception. His, quote, good, his, quote, nobility, his, quote, immortality only makes sense after he has defined the Jews as the slavish evil that needs to be destroyed before the, quote, good, end quote, can enter the world. What can be said of Nietzsche's noble, therefore, can be said of Badiou's immortal. For all of Badiou's distinctions and disavowals, what emerges is, in fact, repetitions. And as with those whose, quote, noble, end quote, thoughts he repeats, Badiou's thoughts on, quote, the Jews and, quote, anti-Semitism tells us far more about the phenomenon under discussion than he himself would have us believe.